Scout of the Endless Frontier, Episode 4, A Refuge in the Void. Written and read by Elton Gar. As the Ghostwake flew away from the Commonwealth as fast as it could go, Elias thought more about his family than he had in years. He had never been as independent as people assumed, especially before the war. He had especially relied on his mother, who had been the only solid ground he had ever truly trusted. His sister Selma was more difficult. She was his opposite in almost every way. Where he wanted to explore and have adventures, she wanted to stay at home. He wanted to be extraordinary, and she claimed to want to be ordinary. She barely even took the credits that he sent her, except to put it towards the education of Dee and Micah, his niece and nephew. He missed them too, in a way that was hard to explain, since he had never actually met them, never even seen a video of them, only a few small grainy pictures, and as he glanced at the last living organism from Kelthier 6, he wondered if he would ever see them. Because, even as he had fled deeper into the frontier, into areas no human had ever seen, it was his family who he feared for. He knew he was being hunted by at least one person at Vitalis Corporation. And, with the information she had gotten, Allie would have power. That was why flying away was the best thing he could do, not just outside of Commonwealth territory, but outside of communication range. It wasn't a perfect plan, but if she couldn't contact him, then his family would have no value for her. He picked his destination at random, a star system that he had no reason to believe had anything but a place to recharge solar batteries. As soon as he fell into orbit of the sun, he allowed the Ghostwake to begin to deploy solar collectors. They doubled as extensions for the ship's sensors, which would catalog the dust and rocks in an uncatalogued system. With nothing to do but wait, Elias began to bounce for a small rubber ball off a wall. It was worn, chewed up, and dripping with dog saliva, and Elias feared that if anything happened to it, Rust would finally lose his mind after almost 2 weeks in the Ghostwake. Rust jumped for the ball each time it went by, until he caught it and ran over to his bed. Then he laid down, ball between his feet, watching Elias carefully in case he tried to take it from him. Instead, Elias picked a book at random from the computer. He kept little entertainment on the Ghostwake. Most videos and audio were created by the corporations, but a person could still write a book on their own and not need to appeal to the corps. He had read about 20 pages of a badly written novel about a human in the 20th century being transported to the world of the Drendians when a light began to flash. It was green, so he finished his page, but whoever had written this barely understood the Drendians, so the light might break up the boredom. It was a signal, but too consistent to actually be communications. That could be several things, but the most likely was a distress call or simply a transponder. Either way, he sat down to the controls of the Ghostwake and began to move in that direction. He turned off his own transponder as he approached the signal. People in the past used to imagine how ships could become invisible in space. That showed a pretty big misunderstanding of just how vast space was. All you had to do to become virtually invisible in space was not tell everyone where you were and not be big enough to cause a gravity well. He quickly came upon a derelict ship of a type he had never seen before. This far out would have been more surprising if it was one he recognized, but there was almost no energy coming from the ship, and it was badly damaged enough that it was a surprise it could even send out a distress call. The only reason any of it was intact was because the ship was modular. It had 7 distinct parts. At its center was a Mobius strip. That was an interesting design. With artificial gravity, it gave you more floor space. But, while there was a logic behind it, he had never seen a ship use the design. The twisted circle was barely intact, broken into sections, held together, mostly, by twisted pieces of metal and cable. The remaining modules were large spheres attached to the strip. Spherical ships were another idea that was technically the most efficient way to build a ship, but there were key issues of functionality. Each of the spheres was at least 5 times the size of the Ghostwake. That would still have made it a fairly small ship by corporate standards. Worse, 5 of the 6 spheres had also been broken open. This wouldn't be a rescue operation, he thought, but, even damaged, alien tech could be valuable, and the ship could have supplies. One reason the spheres were so rarely used in space was that they were difficult to dock with. So he decided on a spacewalk, and so landed the Ghostwake on the flattest part of the Mobius Strip. The only real problem he saw with that, besides how uncomfortable being in a spacesuit was that Rust couldn't go with him. Rust understood as soon as Elias began to put on his spacesuit and put his head between his paws and looked up at Elias with a pitiful gaze. Elias tried to ignore the dog. Then, after a few minutes, he said, "You can't go on a spacewalk unless you're willing to wear a spacesuit." He knew, as soon as he said the word walk, that it was a mistake. Rust wasn't his first dog, but he was also far smarter than the average dog, and the only thing he did was raise his ears for a moment, then close his eyes. Getting inside the ship wasn't difficult, since there were large holes in the side. The hallway he entered was dead, but everything about it spoke to something truly alien. The floor wasn't flat, like he would have assumed, but curved upwards towards the walls that twisted, so at a distance every door and window was at a wrong angle. But when he reached them they were normal, giving the entire place a surreal feel. When he arrived at the sphere, the entrance was on the roof. He could get to that simply by walking the entire loop of the Mobius strip, if there was enough intact to do that. But he was wearing magnetic boots, so with some effort he crossed the halfway point on the wall, and the gravity shifted. Then he fell to what was both the ceiling and the floor. The entrance to the sphere was also odd. It was a large circle on the floor, except that there was a twisted ramp, and as he followed the ramp the gravity shifted, so that by the time he reached the door it was at the normal angle of a door. As he took the last steps towards the door, the wall behind Elias slid shut. There was no sound in the vacuum of space, but in his mind he heard the hum of gears and the click of a lock, making escape much more difficult. Then, after a few seconds, the door in front of him opened. As he passed through the oddly designed airlock, the spacesuit began to give him readings on the air. For now he ignored those and stepped into the sphere, and just about fell over as the gravity shifted again. As strange as the twisted hallway had been, this was even more strange. The entire area was a massive room, curved around another sphere that made up the ceiling, and held in place by regular pillars, except those pillars were also twisted, so that they looked almost like ramps. And the entire thing was filled with thousands of plastic spheres with openings at the top. This was the cargo he was looking for. The spheres were piled up in pyramid shapes, and came from both the floor where he was standing and the ceiling. So, the gravity in this place was mixed too, and he suspected the pillars allowed something alien to move between the different gravities. The spheres of the ship weren't big enough for the floor to feel flat, so every step felt like it was on a slanted floor, making moving around the circle difficult. But he was impressed by the amount of storage. This didn't feel like enough storage for a short trip. It was enough storage for a colony ship. But he ignored that for now. He needed to secure the area before checking the cargo. Besides, if he picked up an orb, he feared the rest would roll everywhere, and he didn't know how they would interact with the curved floor and the gravity. On the opposite side of the sphere was another entrance that led to an interior sphere. Getting to it was tricky, as he had to use one of the odd pillars to pull himself up and then fall down to the floor. Once he got in, he found a layer filled with machinery. For the first time, the odd gravity didn't catch him off guard, and as he walked through the machinery, both on the floor and ceiling, creating odd shadows as they were lit by his helmet's flashlight, he began to see some advantages in this design. One advantage was each sphere protected those below it, and from what he could tell, they'd put the most expendable things in the outer layers. Losing your supplies was bad, but not as bad as losing control of your ship, and as he reached the next level he found what he assumed was a command center, though all of it was designed for something distinctly inhuman. From the size of the sphere below him, he was fairly certain that the next sphere would be its center, if this place held anything of true value. He expected it to be there, and as he entered it, he was entirely certain he was right, in part because the ship wasn't as abandoned as he assumed, because the center sphere was filled with stasis pods. The pods, like so much in this place, were round, but that made more sense as he saw what was in them. The aliens were spheres as well. They were covered in shimmering exoskeletons of blues, greens, and reds, with segments like that of an orange. Each of those segments had a few holes. Some of those holes had odd bulges that he suspected were some type of sensory organ, while others had long, thin, frail limbs that floated in the light blue liquid of the tanks. A few of the tanks had a single creature that fit in it comfortably, while others had smaller creatures. Some held 2 or 3, while others had dozens, barely bigger than the plastic ball that Rust played with. And for the first time, Elias was glad the dog couldn't get here. The last thing he needed was Rust deciding that the alien children were a ball to be played with. Not that he could be certain that the smallest ones were children, but he suspected this was a lifeboat, and they had put the women and children first. That made them human enough for Elias to want to help them. It was also safe to assume that the largest would be the oldest, and, therefore, the most likely to know what to do. So he moved to one of the stasis pods with a large creature. It had swelled so that the exoskeleton was more open, showing wrinkles and writhing pink and blue flesh inside. Like most emergency devices built by intelligent races, this was designed for ease of use. So there were only a couple of buttons. The biggest had an image of a sphere with the front open. Elias didn't love to make guesses when it could injure someone if he was wrong, but the only other option was leaving them, so he pushed the button. The liquid in the machine flowed away first, and the round alien lowered to the bottom and seemed to roll around without any agency. Then, after a few seconds, the exoskeleton tightened and the limbs all pulled in. It was awake. It rolled around inside the glass and metal sphere for a few seconds, until one of the odd bulges was pointed at Elias. More exoskeleton sections slammed shut, closing on the holes in its armor. It was like flower petals closing at night, but much faster. Only the one watching Elias remained open. Elias had typically found that races with natural defenses were more pleasant neighbors than those who had evolved as predators. They could be overcautious, but they didn't attack you for no reason, or declare wars to enslave entire people groups. Either way, he stepped back a few steps, and the glass in the front of the pod opened, and the creature rolled rather than walked out. That explained a lot. Even the shifts in gravity would be less dramatic if you were simply rolling around a corner instead of stepping. It rolled around Elias once. Then one of the 4-foot-long limbs reached out and carefully poked at his spacesuit, then pulled back quickly. After that, it moved to another of the pods. This one had a large sphere in it, and the alien pushed the button. As it began to wake, the first sphere simply rolled out of the room. Going off to check the condition of his ship, Elias assumed. Not sure what else to do, Elias moved out of the way, as about a dozen more of the largest spheres were slowly opened. The second one, if he had to guess from the tools it used to check the others, was a doctor, and the first sphere it woke was security from how it sat and watched Elias carefully. Or perhaps it was a xenobiologist. It was hard to be certain when you had no idea what the device pointed at you did. As lights across the ship began to turn on, Elias hoped waking them hadn't been a mistake. He could fit some of them into his ship, so long as they didn't mind being crowded, but that would mean abandoning the others. Then a smaller creature approached him. It was still big enough to have its own pod, so likely an adult. Perhaps, like humans, different genders had different sizes, or perhaps it was just smaller. But it held a device in a too long, too thin arm and pointed at Elias, who was hit by a grid of red lights. The lights moved back and forth slowly. Elias had been scanned before, and, after a few seconds, slowly turned to help the scanning. As soon as he started to move, it made a harsh guttural sound. So Elias stopped, and the tone seemed to calm. Got it. Don't move. Green lights mixed with the red, and then the creature said, "Greetings. One who calls himself Elias. We are Shorlin. We are grateful for your aid. Those who were to wake us appear to have died, but I fear you have helped us only a short time, as we have no place to go. You must come from somewhere. If this is an emergency, why not go home? Our home world was on the border of Ovark space. They are a devouring swarm that ingests entire worlds. They use us as food, our shells as armor, and the resources of our world to build ships to hunt us. And they were the ones who nearly destroyed your ship? The creature rolled backwards, the small, segmented pieces of the exoskeleton expanding and contracting to make it move smoothly, with no need to extend out its limbs. It then said, "Yes, but not how you might assume. We moved outward, and they expanded as well. We were not attacked by their fleet, but by a scout ship. I'm a scout myself, though I have no interest in attacking you. I have explored many worlds and have a database of others. My species is not perfect, but they will try to exploit you, not try to destroy you." He could only hope that was true as the green lines continued to scan him, and the creature said, "Yes, I see one world in your memories that may work. But I must warn you, the Ovark will reach your people, and they see the entire universe as nothing but resources to grow." "I suspect my people are better at conflict than yours," Elias said. "Indeed, I think you are. Perhaps that will save you. But my people were united, and, from your mind, I see that our technology was more advanced than yours. And yet we lost. But that is a problem for the future. You came here with a purpose. The pods in Sphere 4 were destroyed, as were the engines. But a segment of the supplies remain. There is enough to fulfill your goal and repay you for your kindness." "If you have no use for it, I will take it. But I do not need repaid, though a copy of your species' cultural database, music, history, games, that sort of thing, would be of great value to me, and help ensure that something of us survives if the Ovar find us again. That can be arranged, but you should return to your ship. We will leave for this new world as soon as we can prepare." "A few hours." Elias thought that was optimistic. The ship was almost entirely destroyed, but he only said, "Then I should gather the supplies?" "We will leave behind what we do not need," the Shorlin said. Elias was simply glad to have helped, and as he saw one of the larger creatures pulling a small one out of its pod and holding it gently, he felt more connected to his own family. He had saved someone, at least. While he was watching, a small chip was slipped into his hand by long, frail fingers. Once back in the Ghostwake, he gave Rust a treat to apologize for leaving him. He then sat and watched. A few minutes after he arrived, the fully intact sphere disconnected from the Mobius strip. Then a second sphere detached and extended out long tubes that connected to the first. And then another detached. In moments, all that was left was the odd ring-like center and one broken sphere. It was an excellent design for a ship. It could survive even if only one of the sections wasn't destroyed, and after a moment the new smaller ship disappeared in a flash of light. Elias hoped they would find the world that they had chosen comfortable. At least they might escape the Ovark for a while. As for their warning, and the need for humanity to unite in a common goal to survive, he doubted it would work, but at least he'd get some supplies out of the deal. Author's note: I hope that the structure of this series is beginning to become clear. I feel that the episodic nature has been largely successful at both keeping the story digestible and making each story feel like it happened after the last one. Beyond that, I am enjoying being able to begin to introduce some of the bigger conflicts. The nature of the corporations and how dangerous it is to be on the wrong side of them is one conflict. But there are conflicts external to the Commonwealth as well, and I'm looking forward to see what happens when those, along with some of the other parts of the story, begin to interact. All that said, the biggest constraint in these stories has been space. Trying to fit in both some amount of Elias's personal life, along with the story, isn't always easy. But then, that's the fun of writing a series. And as we get to know Elias and Russ better, it takes less time to explore their part of the story. As always, you can find more by signing up for my newsletter at www.anscifi.com, and you can get access to patron-exclusive stories every week at patron.com/Elton. Thank you, Elton Gar.